welcome everyone. This is, this is the new world. So here we are in an online meeting that otherwise would be taking place at the Rudolf Steiner House. I would like to also acknowledge my gratitude to the Great Lakes branch. I was able to spend 3 weeks in a scholars retreat at the Rudolf Steiner House, and in part it was preparing for what we would be doing during this Holy Week, which has now completely changed because we're not there in person. So my thanks, and also I'd like to dedicate this evening's talk to one of the Great Lakes Branch board members, Kathy Seraphin, who's been getting up close and personal with the illness that's sweeping across the earth. She's on the mend, so just want to say good health to Kathy. And also I'd like to share a prayer from Adam Biddleston before we get started for the peoples of the world. O Christ, Thou knowest the souls and spirits whose deeds have woven each country's destiny. May we who today share the world's life find the strength and the light of Thy servant Michael, and our hearts be warmed by Thy blessing, O Christ, that our deeds may serve the healing of peoples. And thank you to Adam Biddleston, because tonight's talk is intended to be about the healing impulse of the master Renaissance artist Raphael's painting of the Transfiguration. But I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that during the course of this presentation, the moon is going to rise where I am in Northwest Lower Michigan. For some of you further east and further south, that has already happened. But it's not going to happen for me for another about 15 minutes. But this is a really sacred moment because every year, for the first time each year, the full moon will happen below the celestial equator. But when that moon rises and the sun sets, we have a celestial contradiction where, according to Earth horizon, it looks like the sun is below the horizon and the moon is above. But relative to the stars and the celestial equator, the sun is actually above the equator and the moon is below. So we have this really wonderful moment where they trade places in the hemispheres, but what we're seeing in the sky is the exact opposite of what's happening. And that is a moment to pay attention to because things are not what they seem. And I liken this to what Rudolf Steiner describes in reference to the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz on day 2, when as the pilgrim to the wedding, he enters the castle. So I'd like to start with just reading these few lines from Rudolf Steiner to put us in the mood that because we are meeting as this moon is waxing toward full phase, it's rising up above the horizon and the sun is setting, that we are now entering the castle. And from this moonrise until sunrise on Easter Sunday, we will be in that castle. This is the sacred time that happens every single year during the Holy Week, sometimes for just a few hours if the full moon happens on Saturday, sometimes for several days like this year when this full moon will happen on Tuesday. So the thing to bear in mind is what Rudolf Steiner says here: when we enter that castle, then the tests will ensue. I also think of this moment as when the earth regains its position at the center. Not necessarily physically at the center, but it becomes central to the attention of a living cosmos that looks toward humanity on the earth to see how the mystery of Golgotha lives in us as human beings. This cosmic mystery that happened on the stage of the earth, and the spiritual world looks toward humanity at this time. We are the central to their attention to see how are we living the reality of this mystery that happened here on the earth. So here's what's about to happen as this full moon is rising and the sun is setting. The second day's labor brings the soul experiences that decide whether or not the seeker of the spirit will attain the faculties for true spiritual perception, or whether his soul will be surrounded by a world of spiritual error. For his capacity of perception, these experiences are clothed in the imagination of entering a castle where the world of spiritual experience is administered. So here we go. All right. So the topic for tonight is the healing impulse of Raphael's Transfiguration, specifically for Easter 2020, mainly because of the virus that's sweeping across the earth and the healing impulse that can come from the masterwork of Raphael. So I'm going to share a lot of content that's going to first include historically where the transfiguration happens in the cycle of the year, when it is placed in the calendar, also what it is as an event, and then connect this to the very brief biography of Raphael and his painting of the Transfiguration, and then my research about what I see it connected to relative to the sky and to some of the arts of the Goetheanum. So as you can tell, that's kind of a lot of content, but we're going to give it our best go. All right. So the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor is recorded in 3 different places in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 17, in Mark chapter 9, and also in Luke chapter 9. And it's celebrated in our calendar on August 6th each year as a fixed feast day. So it's not one that moves around. It always happens on August 6th, no matter which day of the week that is. Now, Rudolf Steiner, in speaking about the calendar, said that the feast days and the festival days are placed in the calendar by a higher wisdom, even if calendar makers are not aware that that's what's going on. So it makes me always then ask the question, all right, why August 6th? When in the biblical narrative does the Transfiguration take place relative to the events of the Holy Week and the crucifixion and the resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost? Where does it fall in that cycle of experiences? So it's occurring according to the rendering in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It occurs about 8 days after the feeding of the multitude, where there are but 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and several thousand people are fed. So this is the miracle of feeding the multitude that happens. So the Transfiguration itself on Mount Tabor happens about 8 days after that event. Now, this puts it happening at the beginning of August, puts it at the beginning of May, which is around the time when we have the Feast of the Ascension. So Ascension is a movable feast because it's rooted in Easter, which itself is rooted in the relationship of earth to sun and earth to moon. You have to know when the full moon is in the spring to determine when the first sun day will happen so that you can find the Easter festival. And then Ascension is going to happen 40 days after that. So 9 months from Transfiguration is putting us kind of close to the Ascension, but it's not always exact. But this is an interesting relationship because Transfiguration and Ascension are oftentimes confounded and confused one with the other. But you could say that the Transfiguration is kind of a foreshadowing of the fulfillment that's going to happen when Ascension does occur. Now, a transfiguration is also described as a momentary divine radiance. And there are stories of this having occurred in the life of Moses, in the Buddha's enlightenment, and in the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. These things are also sometimes referred to as a transfiguration. And then this event happening on Mount Tabor, there's also a clue there. Rudolf Steiner says that when an event occurs on a mountain, that word mountain is a key word that means an initiation is taking place. So something that happens on the mountain is a reference to initiation. And then the transfiguration of the Christ on Mount Tabor marks a moment of significance. It's really, really important in the narrative of what's happening with the Christ being. This transfiguration is a significant moment. So just to, again, put us within the context. So the feeding of the multitude had just happened the week before, about 8 days before. And so there were 5 loaves, which brings to mind the region of the constellation Virgo. Virgo is oftentimes represented as holding, if not a child, then a shaft of wheat. And so Virgo seems to represent that one pole of what's happening in this miracle of feeding the 5,000. And then the two fishes can be imagined as representing Pisces. So we have these images that suggest the Pisces-Virgo axis of the zodiac. Pisces representing the place where the sun is moving in the spring, when it's rising above the celestial equator, and Virgo representing that axis of the zodiac that the sun crosses when it's in the fall, going across the autumn equinox point. Now, Rudolf Steiner points to this particular axis of Pisces-Virgo as being very significant for the spiritual scientist and for humanity as the axis of dawn and dusk, where we can have free engagement with the spiritual world, and that this is where we should exercise our forces of engagement, because in these places are where we can keep ourselves and keep the spiritual world free. The perpendicular axis of Gemini Sagittarius, he says it's quite a bit different what he describes about that axis. I'm not going to describe that now, but just want to point out that the feeding of the 5,000 seems to be related to this Pisces-Virgo axis. Also, there's a certain trust that's exhibited, that we can trust that our needs will be met. We will have what we need, even though when it looks like resources are scarce, there is an abundance. There's never scarcity. We don't have to have this fear of going without. So this is something that speaks behind this event. But also, at that time of year, if we figure that the Transfiguration is happening on August 6th, and the feeding of the 5,000 happened 8 days earlier, that happens around the 29th of July, which puts it very, very close to the summer cross-quarter day, which is the halfway point in the season. So each season has its cross-quarter. It's just the halfway point. In the winter, the cross-quarter is, in the United States, it's called Groundhog's Day, sometimes referred to as Candlemas. In the spring, the cross-quarter day is May Day. In the fall, the cross-quarter day is All Saints Day and All Souls Day, but it's more popularly known by what happens on the eve. All Hallowed Eve is the eve of cross-quarter. So this feeding of the multitude would have happened close to the summer cross-quarter day, which is referred to as Lammas, which means loaf mass. And it's when the first loaf, the first wheat harvest comes in or came in, and that wheat would be ground into flour, the flour baked into bread, and the bread taken and offered as a blessing for the rest of the harvest. So this event is taking place within the context of something that's happening in the agricultural cycle. So there's a really beautiful harmony that something is set up, and now it's as though our needs will be met, and we are about to enter into one of, I would say, the first steps toward the events that are now going to take place during the Holy Week that's going to come several months later. So the Christ being then after, at least according to the Luke Gospel, which I've chosen not only because I love it, but because according to Raphael scholars, he followed the Luke Gospel in the painting of the Transfiguration. But in the Luke Gospel, after the feeding of the multitude, then the Christ asks his disciples, and it came to pass as he was praying alone, his disciples were with him, and he asked them, saying, "Whom do the people say that I am?" And their response to him, they answering said, "John the Baptist," but some say Elias, and some of them say that the old prophets are risen again. So this is being said before the Transfiguration happens. This is the setup. So we've had this activity that's happening at the Pisces-Virgo axis, where we have free engagement with the spiritual world. And now it's the apostles that are saying, well, they say that maybe it's John the Baptist, maybe it's Elias, maybe it's one of the old prophets that's risen. So this is the way it's in the King James Version in the Luke Gospel. And then he takes John, James, and Peter up to Mount Tabor, and the Transfiguration occurs, and they see him there then with Elias, with Moses. And it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings, he took Peter, John, and James and went up into the mountain to pray. And as he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment was white and glistering. And behold, there talked with him two men, which were Moses and Elias. So here is Raphael's painting of this scene. And right now we're only describing the top part of the composition. There's a very unique architectural composition living behind this image. But there we see the Christ being transfigured. His countenance is altered. His raiment is white and glistering. He has on his right side holding the book, that's Moses, and on the left side is Elias. Now, if we look at Rudolf Steiner's calendar of the soul for the verse that corresponds to the Transfiguration, which is week 18, which includes August 6th, we come to the verse, "Can I expand my soul, that it unites itself with cosmic word received as seed? I sense that I must find the strength to fashion worthily my soul as fitting raiment for the spirit." So this raiment, in my imagination of what Rudolf Steiner is doing with the calendar of the soul, is a direct reference to the raiment of the Christ being at the Transfiguration. So this is something that the soul is experiencing every year when we pass through this feast day. Not only that, but when we look further into the picture, we can see other things that are happening, particularly the young man in the bottom right portion of the lower half of the composition, who seems to be having an epileptic seizure or just past having had that seizure. And this comes later, the description of this event later in the Luke Gospel, right after the Transfiguration takes place. But if we go further in the calendar of the soul with Rudolf Steiner, first we have the Transfiguration verse, verse 18, and this reference to the raiment. And what happens when the apostles, after they experience the transfigured Christ, he says to them, "Tell no one that this has happened." And in the next verse with Rudolf Steiner in the calendar of the soul, verse 19, "Now it is in secret to encompass now with memory what I've newly got." So it's keeping something secret, which is what happens after the transfiguration. They're told, tell no one, say nothing. And then the next verse, the verse 20, we come to the Luciferic temptation, which is, "I feel at last my life's reality, which severed from the world's existence would in itself obliterate itself, and building only on its own foundation would in itself bring death upon itself." So these three verses seem, we could read them in part, not exactly what's being depicted in the image that Raphael painted, but in the story combined with this image. So first we have the Transfiguration, then we have the apostles being told to tell no one, and then we have this image of this epileptic boy. And so in the calendar of the soul verses, it's that the soul would experience this striving to fashion worthily the soul as fitting raiment for the spirit, which is a reference to Transfiguration. Then the next verse, to keep in secret what has been realized. And then the following verse, to recognize this Luciferic temptation that can draw me out of life, that really seems to be suggested by what's happening with the epileptic boy. Okay, sorry if you are hearing an alarm. That's to tell me that the moon is about to rise. So for the next 15 minutes, where I am sitting in northern Michigan, the moon will be coming up over the horizon and the sun will be setting. Okay, so really getting into the castle now. All right. So if you follow this next bit, this is one slide where there will be the most words, and this comes directly from Rudolf Steiner, talking about this event of the Transfiguration. And he's giving it in the context of the Buddha. And he's saying that you have stories that are oftentimes similar when speaking about spiritual initiates or the great spiritual leaders of humanity, but there's a very significant difference between what happens in the life of the Buddha and what's happening in the life of Jesus. And what he's pointing at is it's the experience of transfiguration that gives us a clue to the significant difference between these two great spiritual beings. So I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but just to, I do have the reference for this, and I will have a bibliography at the end that I can share with everyone if you would like to research further. But he's giving this description of what's happening at the Transfiguration. He's taking Peter, John, and James to the mountain, and there he's illumined from within. Moses and Elias appear on either side of him, and the disciples are receiving at this moment significant revelations. Rudolf Steiner says that this is an indication of a moment of supreme importance. This is all a direct quote from Rudolf Steiner. So Moses and Elias are appearing on either side of Christ Jesus, and now he gives this description of how, because they are coming out of the past in time, that this starts to suggest that the disciples are being given an opportunity to see beyond the realm of space and time that governs the physical world, and that this is, in this particular lecture, described as their having been given the vision of Devachan. So following the Transfiguration is when we first come to what is significant. So we've had the feeding of the 5,000, the Transfiguration takes place, the Christ being tells the apostles to tell no one, and then Rudolf Steiner is saying now is an incisive moment. Because with the life of the Buddha, this paragraph I'm just going to read out. It's the actual sacrificial death, the suffering, the dying, which does not occur in the life of the Buddha. Buddha went out with his disciple Ananda and became illumined. When the scene is described in the life of Buddha, it is given a different form, adapted to the understanding of that time and place. But the Transfiguration, however, comes at the end of Buddha's life, whereas the really significant epic in the life of Jesus begins with this event. So that it's not receiving illumination and leaving earthly incarnation and going back into the spiritual world. It's receiving illumination and then going through the threshold of death with humanity at the mystery of Golgotha. So opening that door Christ Jesus is the first one to do this, and it's preceded by this transfiguration. So it's not transfiguring and ascending and leaving. It's transfiguration, staying with the body, going across the threshold of death, and then ascending. So this is really significant, this difference between the Buddha and the Christ, and it's the Transfiguration that really is a defining moment in that. Okay, I'm going to leave that aside just for a moment, and now we're going to start talking about Raphael. So, Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino, excuse my Italian, a mighty spirit at the parting of the ways in human evolution. So in this context, Rudolf Steiner is talking about what's happening historically at the time that Raphael is on the earth. It's the High Renaissance, but something is about to change pretty dramatically. But Raphael, this is a self-portrait that was painted between 1506 and 08. He was born at Urbino in 1483. His mother died, I think, when he was only 8 years old, and his father died when he was 11, but not before arranging for him to become an apprentice to Perugino, who was a master artist at Perugia. And he went there at the age of 11, and by the age of 17, he was given the designation of master. So that seems quite young, but this is the course of what's happening with Raphael in a very abbreviated way. So a few years later, he went to Florence in 1504. This is when his Madonnas started to really become very popular, and this put him in the company of people of means, people in high position. He enjoyed a social popularity as an artist, and also unusually, something that he was recognized for in his own lifetime, even though his lifetime was quite short. At the age of 25, then he went to the Vatican and began his work in Rome. In 1515, Pope Leo X appointed him prefect of antiquities. And so it seems that he was given the responsibility for anybody that was doing excavating or any kind of work throughout Rome and within a mile of the boundary of the city. They had to get permission from Raphael before they could do anything. So this was a way to make sure that the things of the past were not being destroyed. And it spoke to a sadness in his soul that things were being lost and things were being destroyed because people were not paying attention to this great art that was coming out of former cultures and former time. And then He died only 5 years later at Rome on Good Friday, April 6th, 1520. It was his 37th birthday, and that was 500 years ago yesterday. Now, 500 years ago last year in May was the anniversary of the death of Leonardo da Vinci. So Leonardo da Vinci was quite a bit older than Raphael, but he died just not quite a year before Raphael in 1519, and then Raphael died in the spring of 1520. So we have these two master artists that have kind of been bookending this last year, the 500th anniversaries of their death, which I have considered just an awesome thing to contemplate. Now, his painting of Pope Leo X is significant because how the individuals in this image play out in Raphael's biography. I'm really only going to talk about how it leads to the Transfiguration. So this is Leo X with Giulio de' Medici and Luigi de' Rossi. Giulio de' Medici is the one on the left of Pope Leo X. This was painted by Raphael in 1517. And Giulio de' Medici was Archbishop of Narbonne when he commissioned the Transfiguration from Raphael in 1516. So this person to the left of Pope Leo there, he's the one that commissions the Transfiguration. After Raphael died, Giulio de' Medici was not yet Pope, but he kept the Transfiguration in his own possession for several years. And then he became Pope, and then he gifted it back. I'm sorry that I don't remember the name of the church that he gave it to, but it didn't just stay in one place after Raphael died. And the story, at least that Vasari wrote, was that when Raphael died, the painting was beside his bed. And then it was displayed in state with him. And he was buried the very next day. But then Giulio de' Medici kept it for several years. And then it was put up in a church in Rome. But then when Napoleon invaded, he took all the Raphaels, and he had the Transfiguration put in the Grand Gallery in Paris. And there's a painting of his wedding procession, and they're walking in front of all of the Raphaels that they took from Italy. But eventually, it was after Napoleon was exiled, and through the Treaty of Paris, many of the works went back to Rome. Now, the interesting thing, really the fascinating thing about Giulio de' Medici, he was considered a man of great authority, Leo's other self, but he is it's so incredible what happens during his time. Because here he is, he's the individual that commissions this great work of art, which for several centuries was considered the greatest work of art in the history of humanity. This was how the Transfiguration was regarded. So this is just before he becomes Pope. And just before he dies, at the other end, he's the person that personally approves the heliocentric theory that's introduced by Nicholas Copernicus, which Rudolf Steiner points to as a thought. The way it's introduced by Copernicus is completely devoid of spiritual content. So we have bookending the papal career of Giulio de' Medici, this high commission for this high art, the Transfiguration, which is this union of sensible and supersensible mysteries on the one end, and on the other end, this approval of a thought that will separate the sensible from the supersensible world. And it's fascinating to consider that there's an individual that kind of lands historically in the place that is connected with all of these things. During Giulio's papacy, this is when, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is struggling for power with Francis I of France. It's when Suleiman, I think he's called the Magnificent, he's invading from the east. Henry VIII has left the church because he wants to get divorced. There's all these this maelstrom of things that are happening during the papacy of Giulio. He becomes Clement VII. But what's most interesting for our talk is that he commissioned the Transfiguration, and then he also approved Nicholas Copernicus's theory, even though 99 years later, Galileo was put on trial for heresy for the very same ideas. All right, so this is a very early painting by Raphael. that was done 1499 to 1502. So he's maybe 16 years old. This particular image is in São Paulo in Brazil. And it shows, I think, an early attempt at harmony and symmetry in composition that would find expression in Raphael's final work. Okay, so here we have the Transfiguration. I'm going to come back to that image of the resurrection, but I want to point out a few of the elements. Living as he did during the Renaissance, Raphael probably was well aware of the 7 liberal arts. The 4 of number are called the quadrivium, and they include arithmetic, geometry, harmony, and astronomy. So it's possible to read this according to those 4 liberal arts. So looking at the number of elements that are to be included, their relationship spatially, the angles of relationship between them that suggest the geometry of it, the harmony that comes into it. Now, of course, this is not a piece of music, but the flow that would be exhibited in the way the composition comes together suggests harmony. And then also the astronomy, which is not evident at first, but at least in my imagination, informs what this image is. But just to talk about a couple of the details, of a few of the elements that are in this image, particularly the woman that is kneeling down in the foreground, oftentimes referred to as the Sophia or the divine feminine. She's, I think, really important in the story of what happens with the Christ being, because this is the Canigiani Holy Family by Raphael. And here we see the Virgin Mary together with her cousin Elizabeth. Elizabeth has given birth to the infant John. Mary has already given birth to the Christ child, and Joseph is there with them. Now, in the story, the way it's rendered in the biblical account, particularly in the Gospel of St. Luke, what happens is the Archangel Gabriel makes an annunciation to Zacharias, Elizabeth's husband, that she will bear a child, even though she's quite advanced in age. And so this annunciation is made. And then 6 months later, Archangel Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary and announces that should she choose to accept the annunciation, that she will give birth to the Christ child. She accepts this annunciation, and then the description is that she travels to her cousin Elizabeth, and they spend 3 months together. And after that 3 months, Mary travels back to Bethlehem, and then Elizabeth gives birth to John. All right, so during that 3 months, it's the last trimester of Elizabeth's pregnancy, and it's the first trimester of Mary's pregnancy. So their pregnancies overlap, and it's been prophesied to Elizabeth that when she comes into the presence of her Lord, that the Holy Spirit will enter into her being. And she makes a comment when Mary comes into her presence that the Holy Spirit has entered into her being, right into her womb, and the child has leapt in her womb, as though in recognition that now the Christ is present. So this is happening. The Annunciation to Mary happens on March 25th. The Feast of St. John, which is a celebration of his birth, happens on June 24th. So that's 3 months. This is the 3 months that Mary and Elizabeth spent together. It's also the exact same 3 months that 33 years later, the mystery of Golgotha will unfold. So we have this setup that's happening between these two women, this divine feminine that is taking up a task and laying down the preparation in a rhythm of time in the exact same space in the cycle of the year that later this mystery will be realized. And so in part, this feminine that shows up in Renaissance art, she's present in all the images of the Annunciation. She shows up in many different ways. It's somehow acknowledging not only, there's a lot of mystery that goes into why the feminine is present, but I really, really think, particularly because of Raphael's relationship to the paintings of the Madonnas and his emphasis on the birth experience and the child and the mother, that it has something to do with the role that the feminine plays in making it possible for these mysteries to be realized. Another detail that I want to point out in the lower portion of the image has to do with the boy that's having the epileptic seizure. Now, when you read the Gospel of St. Luke, or in each of these Gospels, this boy is described immediately after the Transfiguration. So the Christ being tells the apostles to tell no man what they have seen on Mount Tabor, and then they go into the community. And there, this man in green that's standing behind the boy, he is usually interpreted as the boy's father, is bringing him. In this image, he's shown as though he's coming to the apostles, which is really interesting. At the beginning of the Luke Gospel, the very beginning of the chapter 9, it says, "Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all devils and to cure diseases. And he sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick." So this is already happening at the beginning of chapter 9. But then when we come to this experience with this boy having an epileptic seizure, they're not able to help him. They're not able to do anything. And those who are in the lower portion of the image, they're pointing, the ones that are pointing, none of them are looking. They're not seeing what's happening on top of the mountain. They're just pointing. They're very agitated. They're unable to help this boy, even though they've already been granted the power and the authority to do this healing. So that suggests that there's something else going on there. And what I imagine is that there's this moment that Rudolf Steiner describes in the experience of the soul as we're passing through the time between death and rebirth. And he gives a very specific description of the soul's experience in each one of the planetary spheres. And then he says there's a moment that comes that can be described as though it's a shock. It's a shock when the human being turns from being concerned with and has in their attention the life that has just been led toward the future life. And that this shock can be such that we don't necessarily stay awake. I'm using words of the physical world to describe something that's happening across the threshold, but we can't sustain the consciousness of then what comes after that moment. To put it in the context of the chemical wedding, this is when Christian Rosenkreuz is expelled on the 6th level of the Olympus Tower, and he thinks that he's being punished or somehow demoted, but actually he's being elevated to the place where he will now actually collaborate in working on the future body. And Rudolf Steiner describes this as something that is reserved only for the most advanced souls. But even for those advanced souls, there is this experience as of a shock that happens at that moment. Now, when we look at this individual that's having this epileptic seizure, it looks like he's not at all in control. But I imagine that what Raphael has done here is kind of worked in a mystery of what can become out of that moment when one has gone through the initiation that's actually happening there on the top of Mount Tabor. And I'm sharing with you an imagination that I have, and I welcome your striving to research this as well to see whether or not you agree with me. But that I think that this is in part what Rudolf Steiner was answering in the carving of the representative of humanity. So if you look at the kind of flailing arms of the epileptic boy who really doesn't have any grasp or control of his will forces, and juxtapose that with the representative of humanity who has this very conscious relationship with the Luciferic being and with the Ahrimanic being, and is taking that middle path between them. Also remembering that in the calendar of the soul, the second verse after the Transfiguration verse is the Luciferic temptation verse, which seems to be related to what's happening with the boy there that's painted by Raphael that's exhibiting this epileptic seizure. Okay, now I want to point out some of the other Transfiguration images that were being created contemporary to Raphael. This one is an icon that was done by Theophanes the Greek in the 15th century, just after Raphael. But why I chose it is because it has the same elements. We've got the Christ being with this shining raiment. You have Moses and Elijah or Elias on either side. They don't quite have the appearance of being ascended in the sky the way Raphael was able to achieve it. They look rather like they're on top of the mountain. and the little figures in either side in the mountain. It's first the Christ leading the apostles up the mountain and then leading them back down. And then beneath him, he has, it's usually described as James on the left side, Peter at the center, and John on the right side. And again, this is really gives us an opportunity to think about how the quadrivium might have been informing these Renaissance artists. So the number of elements that are used, certain things had to be included in order to tell a particular story. And then geometrically, they had to be placed in space. These number of elements had to be in a certain relationship with one another in space. There needed to be a harmony and a flow in the image, which is the experience of number in time, and then living behind that, the mystery of the astronomy, which is number in space and in time. So we can see the similarity between these two images. It looks as though Theophanes the Greek has only created the top half of Raphael's Transfiguration. So Raphael has the transfigured Christ, he has Elias and Moses, he has the two individuals that are down and to the left, with the only person in the scene on the earth that's actually looking at the Christ. And then you've got James crouching down in green on the left, Peter at the center, and then John at the right in the top portion of the image. Okay, now I want to relate this image to the resurrection that Raphael painted when he was only 16 years old. So we can see that there is a similarity in the composition. You've got the resurrected Christ. You can tell that he's got an idea in mind. It hasn't been fully realized. He is, after all, under 20 years old. But we have this same imagination of the two beings on either side of the Christ, and you can see in the forms and the gesturing of the people in what would be the lower part of this image of the resurrection, a kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to come when Raphael paints the Transfiguration at the very end of his life. I also think it's really fascinating that he paints his resurrected Christ with a banner that's white with a red cross. So this seems to suggest a relationship to a Rosicrucian mystery, which would have been something that was just happening at that time. The initiation of Christian Rosenkreuz that's described in The Chemical Wedding occurred in 1459. Raphael was born in 1483, so not too long after that initiation. But in addition to seeing the similarity between these two images, I also imagine another form that is informing this, this architectural composition. So taking from the individual that's on the lower left up toward the Christ being, we see a harmony in the first painting of the resurrection and also in this last painting of the Transfiguration. Then, let's see, I want to, I'll come to it. Usually the person in the Transfiguration that's down in the lower left, or yes, with the book, is described as Matthew. And the way he's gesturing, not looking at the viewer of the painting, but the way he's gesturing, he seems to be the one that's inviting us into the scene. And his invitation is, the book to me indicates that he's inviting us to study this mystery, which is the first step on the Rosicrucian path. Now, coming down from the resurrected Christ, we come to this figure that's at the lower right of the resurrection image, who's kind of throwing back, not quite like the epileptic boy in the Transfiguration. Nonetheless, there's this motion in the bottom right corner that seems to suggest that something supersensible is overcoming the sensibility of the human being that's down on the earth. From this lower right image, the person on the lower right, then the eye follows over to the person that's standing on the left. In the Transfiguration image, this points toward these two apostles are usually described as Andrew and Thaddeus, but also if you look at how they lack color, they seem to be isolated away from the activity of what's going on in that lower portion of the Transfiguration painting, which again suggests what Rudolf Steiner describes as the experience of the soul between death and rebirth, that if we have not developed our moral nature or our life of religious devotion, then we will be isolated in the spiritual world. So Raphael seems to be bringing this into consciousness, that already something is present that indicates an isolation of the soul away from the experience. Then looking again back at the resurrection, the line leads up to the angel that is on the right-hand side of the resurrected Christ in the Transfiguration. This takes us up past the John figure toward Moses, and then coming across on the other side, we come to Elias, and then the individual that's wearing red, that's down beneath Elias, is sometimes described as Felicitas, but also I have heard this individual described as Lazarus, who would become Lazarus John. I'm not necessarily prepared to talk about all of this part of the mystery, but by the time the Transfiguration takes place, John the Baptist has already been beheaded. Lazarus has not yet gone through his initiation. So there are some elements there that point both to the immediate past and the immediate future. Something is about to take place. Then going in the resurrection image from the angel on the left, we come back down to the kind of warrior figure that's standing there in the image of the Transfiguration. This takes us down to the crowd of people that are with the Father around the epileptic boy, that are exhibiting compassion and exhibiting concern, and perhaps you could say they are shown in full living color and together with one another, because their caring for one another ensures that they will not be having an experience of isolation when they move through that time after death, between death and a new birth. And then completing the image, we come back to the person that's in the foreground on the lower left corner of the imagination. Now, this kind of looks like a double pentagram, but it's actually a legitimate form that is referred to by Rudolf Steiner as the sun intelligence. And he gives the description of this symbol in the lectures on the Apocalypse of St. John. And he says that this has to do with the occult sign of the Lamb. The Lamb receives the book with the 7 seals, and between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. So these 7 corners of the sign are called horns. And what Rudolf Steiner goes on to describe is that these 7 points are related to the 7 planetary spheres, but also, and the eyes represent the beings that inhabit those spheres that can see toward the human being as we are incarnating and moving through that time between death and rebirth. But also, he gives the very strong indication in this particular lecture that we need to work with this symbol. We need to work with this imagination of the sun intelligence. So I am suggesting to us here that it's possible that this is the form that informed the architectural composition of Raphael's Transfiguration. And it was already present when he was painting this resurrection of the Christ, when he was not yet 20 years old. And there he's holding this flag that seems to suggest the symbol of Rosicrucianism, which may indicate that he was very aware of this symbol. Okay, so this is, again, from Rudolf Steiner. We should allow... We should allow the holy symbols given in the Apocalypse to work upon us. The sign of the sun intelligence, for example, should not remain a mere sign for us. We should immerse ourselves in this sign until we feel it is no longer dead, but flowing with life. The signs should be for us doors, connecting the physical to the spiritual world. So you could imagine that the way Raphael presents his Transfiguration, with the division of the composition between the upper portion and the lower portion, that this is he's actually connecting the physical life to the spiritual world, and particularly if we imagine it in relationship to this form of the sun intelligence. So the way the gestures of the beings and the underneath portion are connecting to the supersensible reality, even though they themselves cannot see it. And not all of them are engaged in that. And each one of them carries a clue about the experience that the human being will have, either going through an initiation process or in the experience of time between between death and rebirth. All right, so now I'm going to segue out of the that symbolism of the Transfiguration and relate it to some different cultural expressions and lead us on to the stars. So this image was painted by Francisco de Holanda. He was a Portuguese court painter, and he was a student of Michelangelo. And it's an image that shows the creation of the universe. So this is the creator conjuring the firmament into existence. And as I was suggesting that Raphael was following the 4 principles of the quadrivium in the liberal arts, Francisco de Holanda was regarded as somebody that really always was trying to give expression to 3 principles: the ideal plane, the incorporeal form, so the immaterial body, and then the imperfect copy of the terrestrial zone. So he also is trying to give expression to something that is supersensibly related to the physical world. And I see in this image something that suggests for me the transfigured Christ in Raphael's imagination. So you can see the fold in Raphael's garment. I didn't point this out when I had the full image there, but it seems to point directly at the Lazarus felicitous individual that's dressed in red, that's on the in the top portion of the painting, and he's the only one that's looking at the Christ. And so we have this like belt of stars in this this creator of the universe, the way Francis Hollanda has drawn him. And his feet are in a particular configuration, and he's got the arms outstretched. But now we start to see the stars coming into this picture and this form, suggesting that perhaps that's where this posture of the Christ is coming from, that it's a star picture that lives behind that. When we look at the Native American culture, particularly here in northern Michigan, in the Great Lakes region where the Ojibwa have been living for centuries, we have their imagination of the constellation region of Orion, which they regard as winter maker. But it's not just Orion itself. Their winter maker constellation takes in both Orion and the bright star in Canis Minor, which has the name Procyon, and then the bright star in Taurus, which has the name Aldebaran. So they join these stars together in a picture that's a little bit different than the way we usually imagine that region of the sky, because on this image that comes from the Ojibwa star map, it shows how you've got the classical Greek constellations in the background, and then they've superimposed on there what the Native American from the Great Lakes region, what their imagination is on those constellations. And also their word, Bibun is winter, and then Bibunanakionini would be winter maker. And it's a word that when they make a reference, they talk about the grandfathers, and snow is regarded as a grandfather. So when winter maker appears in the sky, then the snow is coming, and that's when they have permission to tell the stories. It also, for me, suggests the verse that comes from the book of Job, where God asks Job, "Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow?" And so there's this very sacred relationship to snow that happens in this northern part of the world. I know those of you in Arizona might find that hard to believe, but we do love our snow up here. And again, these outstretched arms, this figure that's quite large, that's rising up. I'm now starting to look at, is there a relationship between the transfigured Christ as Raphael has created it and these imaginations coming out of different cultures that show a relationship in form to the star picture. All right, so here's Orion in the night sky. And typically Orion is, Orion is one of the most popular constellations in the night sky because it can be seen in both the northern and the southern hemisphere. The belt of 3 stars that marks, the 3 stars at the center that mark Orion's belt are actually right on the celestial equator. So every year in March, Orion can be seen both in the north and the south hemisphere. But then Orion begins to set in this season that we're in right now, where we're coming toward the resurrection of the Christ being. the constellation of Orion is actually starting to set below the horizon for us in the northern hemisphere. In the ancient Egyptian culture, the setting of Orion could be likened to the dismemberment of Osiris, one by one the stars setting below the horizon as though his body parts being dismembered. But to find your way around the sky, you can take the belt of Orion, and it points down and left to the brightest star in our sky after the sun, and that's the star Sirius. On this map, I apologize that it's a little bit fuzzy, but on there you can see Orion is at the center. The blue line that goes right through the middle is the celestial equator, so you can see the belt of 3 stars for Orion are right on that equator. And then, let's see, on either side of him, just like the transfigured Christ, there are 2 beings that appear on either side of Orion, not exactly right next to him, but on the right-hand side is the constellation Taurus, and then on the left-hand side, further over, 2 constellations away, we have the constellation Leo, the lion. I'm going to come back to that image. All right, so this first arrow shows us where Orion is. So there he is with his belt laying right on that blue line, which is the celestial equator. He's right at the center of the image. To his upper right is the constellation Taurus. In the picture that came from the Ojibwa, you saw that the left arm of Orion, the hand was marked by the star Aldebaran. That's in the constellation Taurus. Then over on the left of Orion, we have the constellation of Leo the lion. And then down below Leo, below Leo and below Orion, we have the constellation of the Hydra. Now, the whole image isn't shown here, but the Hydra snakes along below the celestial equator, and it has 2 things on its back, Corvus the crow and Crater the cup. So we have these 3 images down here below the celestial equator on the back of this serpent. All right, so again, we have now the Christ being. I'm starting to suggest that he may very well be in his form related to the constellation Orion, in which case we could then imagine that Moses on his right-hand side could be likened to the constellation Taurus, the bull, and then on the left-hand side, Elias or Elijah related to the constellation of Leo, the lion, which puts us in relationship then to, in part, what's included in the great red initiation window at the west end of the Goetheanum. So we see on the left-hand side of this panel, we have the human soul facing the abyss, and below them, these 3 beasts, which could suggest the Hydra with Corvus and Crater below the celestial equator, and that they would represent doubt and fear and hatred. And the human being has to cross that abyss in order to come to the supersensible experience of the Christ within oneself. And then you can see on either side of the central figure in the red window, on the left-hand side, you have the lion, and on the right-hand side, you have the bull, right at what would be the ear region of that mighty figure. So this figure in the great red window does not necessarily have the same form as the constellation Orion or the same gesture as the transfigured Christ. But what I'm suggesting is that there are some elements there that might put them in relationship to one another, and that the Christ being, rather than being imagined only as a being of flesh, the way it's described in the John Gospel, that in the beginning was the Word. And so the red window seems to express that word element. It is the Word become life. And this Word become life out of the preparation through the ages, particularly with the prophets, Elias and Moses, one represented by the lion, the other represented by the bull. And this is a picture of what we see in the sky, this region of Orion, which was regarded as by the ancient Egyptians as connected to their god of the dead, Osiris, who must be, his body must be remembered and brought back together. And Isis, Sophia, the divine feminine, is the one that has this task. So these elements seem to inform what we are seeing in the red window, in Raphael's Transfiguration, and then also what we can imagine as the starry script across the night sky. Remembering that at this season, when the Transfiguration has already happened, when it's occurring in August, Orion is just starting to return to the morning sky in the northern hemisphere. And then in this season, when we have the resurrection of the Christ and the Easter festival here in the spring, now Orion is just starting to set. So also, Asa Turgenev said this wonderful thing about red. In red, the human being experiences in apprehension and veneration the revelation of the divine at the threshold of consciousness between perception and supersensible perception. And so you can see that the individual that's down, he's just in the corner of the detail that I have of Raphael's Transfiguration. He's wearing a red garment. So this is an individual, he's looking at the Christ, and he's the one that is able to have a super sensible perception. This is also what supports the idea that this could be Lazarus, who's the first Christian initiate, after the Christ being transfigures, and then he takes Lazarus through that initiation. Okay, so once again, here is Orion with his belt of 3 stars, remembering that he's got the lion and the bull on either side of him, just as in the great red window, the central figure has the lion and the bull on either side, and down to the left are the 3 beasts. And I am suggesting that these 3 images belong to one another, that standing behind the inspiration for Raphael's Transfiguration not only is this the geometric form of the sun intelligence, but its relationship to this mighty region of the night sky where we find the constellation Orion, which then can also be seen in the great red window at the Goetheanum. Bearing in mind that the great red window was on the opposite end of the building of the Goetheanum, and that the representative of humanity was intended to be on the east end of the building. So in a certain respect, the representative of humanity would be facing the great red window. And so this is a kind of an answer or a transformation of what Raphael is introducing in the Transfiguration between the transfigured Christ and this epileptic being down in the lower portion of his composition. I just want to check it out. Okay. All right, so once again, here we have Orion with Taurus. Now, when we see Taurus, you'll notice that up to the highest up where his shoulder is, we have the star cluster known as the Pleiades. The Pleiades are the 7 sisters. They're the most storied about group of stars in the night sky, and in most cultural traditions, they're related to creation myths. And Rudolf Steiner says about Pleiades that this is the place where all things come into being in our universe. That's the word he uses, the universe. Things come into being in the universe through the Pleiades star cluster. Okay, so Orion is usually in the Greek story shown chasing after Pleiades, but Orion in the context of the ancient Egyptian mythology has to do with the experience of the human being going across the threshold of death. So we have the Orion figure that's connected to the experience of the time after death, and then we have the experience of Pleiades, which is connected to something coming into creation. So this is all happening in the same region of the sky, and it's referenced in the book of Job, where God is admonishing Job and says to him, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades or loose the bands of Orion?" So this seems to be a question to Job, asking him, can you call something into life? Like, can you bind the sweet influence of Pleiades? This is the place from which things come into being in our universe. Have you, O Job, the capacity to call life forth from that region of the stars? And at the other end, have you the capacity to see it across the threshold of death, which is this reference to loosening the bands of Orion? So this coming out of the Old Testament is a prophecy about something that's coming that will see the human being across the threshold of death. And Raphael painted it. So we've got his Sistine Madonna as though in answer to this question about binding the sweet influence of Pleiades. Rudolf Steiner's description of this image is as though the Christ being has wafted out of the spiritual world into the arms of the Virgin Mother. That there's no description of a labor process there, but that this super sensible being came into sensible being, just came right out of the spiritual world and into her arms. And this speaks to this mystery of binding the sweet influence of Pleiades. And then in his transfiguration, particularly if we imagine this form as being informed by the mighty constellation of Orion, he is answering the second part, which is loosing the bands of Orion. The way we loose the bands of Orion, the way we get across that threshold of death, is developing a relationship to the mystery that's being painted in the Transfiguration, this very, very incisive and important moment that's a preparation for the initiation that's about to come. So the Sistine Madonna and the Transfiguration kind of standing there as these incredible and inspired gifts from a master artist at a very incisive moment in the history of humanity, showing us here's how something comes into birth and here's how we see it across the threshold of death. Hermann Grimm made a really beautiful statement about these two images. He says, with his Sistina, or with his Sistine Madonna, Raphael's paintings of the Madonna, and with his Transfiguration, his pictures of the Christ attained their end. So the Sistine Madonna was the end of Raphael's painting of the Madonnas. Not that it was like the end that way, but it's his highest achievement as a painter of the Madonna, and the Transfiguration is his highest achievement as a painter of the Christ being. Okay. And then Rudolf Steiner makes this really marvelous, marvelous statement, not about the Transfiguration, the painting, but about the Transfiguration as an event. Who understands the Transfiguration recognizes the deepest mystery of Christianity. And I would go so far as to say that with Raphael, the Transfiguration becomes humanity's book of destiny. He's showing us a relationship to the supersensible world, and through the form, how to experience that world as an initiation through the planetary spheres that can happen while we're in life, when we're on a spiritual path, but then also what to expect when we've crossed the threshold and are going through the time between death and rebirth. Okay, that is my final slide. So what I'm going to do is stop the sharing and then get back to where I can see everybody, and hopefully there will be some questions or some comments or anything that anybody would like to give. And I would also just like to say that the reason I think it's important to contemplate this right now is because we are dealing with we're in a very, very unusual time as a global humanity. And something in this particular season, quite specifically, is seeking the Christ in us. And the Transfiguration is a very important moment in realizing the mystery of the Christ. And this painting by Raphael, his last painting, which was left unfinished by him, was at the foot of his bed when he died 500 years ago right now. And so it kind of resounds into this space in time, into this week. And it was Good Friday when he died. So we've still got a few days if we were to go by the days of the week. So we're still resonant in this time when Raphael was living and dying with his master work. And also one could even say through his achievement there that perhaps he found his way across the threshold. So in order to ask questions, you can unmute yourselves if you would like. Even if you just want to give a greeting, or Alessandra, is that you? I have a question for you. Have you seen that painting of the Transfiguration? The one from Brazil? You have. So you see both of them.
Yeah, I can share. I'm really moved now with how you're talking.
Okay.
And when I was in Vatican, I didn't know that the Transfiguration was there.
Yes.
But I saw a note on the wall: Transfiguration, go to the Pinacoteca. It's not in the museum. You have to walk and to search for the Pinacoteca. It's in a room.
Uh-huh.
One side it has a copy of the Last Supper.
Okay.
in a not in the wall, but in a curtain with the painting.
Okay.
And the other side we have the Transfiguration, and we have a piano. It's like a room for events or something like this. There was a man playing the piano, and then I entered the room and I saw the Transfiguration, and immediately I started to cry and cry and cry, and I had to sit. I couldn't even look at the Last Supper or anything else about half an hour. And I never thought about this painting this way. I have many paintings or many art works that moves me, but never thought that it would happen this way with the Transfiguration. And I never knew why, or it was just something that happened and happened and happened.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes and every time I see the painting now, I want to cry almost every time. But now that you started to talk about this, it really called me for this, because there is something there. There is a mystery there that I don't know what it is. I never cried so much with a painting or a work of art.
Thank you for sharing that. I was thinking of you when I found that resurrection image that's in Brazil and the story that you had shared with me about it. I have never seen the Transfiguration in person. It will happen.
I will look where is it in São Paulo, when I go there, I will try to see it.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful what you said.
Thank you. So Sarah, I see you are unmuted.
Mary, I was so struck by the influence of Perugino on the first painting, and something had happened to him that just opened him up. And yes, because the Transfiguration is so free, and it has nothing left of the remnants of Perugino. And it's profound, the change within the 4 years.
Yes, yes.
Because you could say almost that Perugino painted the resurrection. It's such his style. And my point. And so if that's still Raphael modeling the master, something in the interim profound happened to him, that he was opened up to be able to paint in this other way. And the heavens opened up for him, and there he could place it in the heavens.
And also yet sustain this form, right? It seems to still have the same architectural composition, like it's living in him, and just trying to keep giving it expression. It's something that it seems to be this eternal mystery that's still presenting itself. And I think for me, that's what suggests the relationship to the star picture, because
he keeps the geometry.
It doesn't change. I'm sorry.
So he keeps the geometry of it.
Yes. Yes.
But it's free. But he's somehow freed.
Oh, totally freed it. Yes. Yes. All right. Does anyone else there like to make a comment or have a question? Yes, no? Everybody's quiet? I like to have talking afterward.
Yes, Mary?
Yes.
I just have one comment. It's many informations, but in a way that I feel moved, and I don't know if questions are coming or something like I'm without words. Just
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Stay with the resonance of what you have said.
Yes, I honor that. Thank you. We are still in this. Well, we have just entered this very sacred time. I know that you shared with me that the moon had already risen by the time that we got here, but the moon is actually not going to be full. It's almost full, but it will be full at 10:36 p.m. in the Eastern time zone. So we're still coming to this moment where that Rudolf Steiner describes, where we don't have the Easter festival just when the sun returns north of the celestial equator. We have to wait for the right witness, and the moon is that witness. And I would just like to say that I was born at this particular full moon, exactly at the same degree of the zodiac where it is tonight.
But today is your birthday, or
tomorrow is my birthday, so the moon is happening full just a few hours before my actual birthday, but same degree of the zodiac. So this is kind of my birthday gift to me. Well, thank you for showing up for me. It's really been the most amazing thing to study this work, to look at what Rudolf Steiner has to say about it, what Hermann Grimm has to say, to look for it in the arts of the Goetheanum, to look through the astronomy, to try to understand the liberal arts, and to really bring these things together while being quarantined and isolated. It's really been so enriching. I can't recommend it enough.
It's a gift for us.
Yeah.
It's a gift for me. Thank you. And congratulations. Happy birthday.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, Mary, we really appreciate what you've done.
Thank you, Burley. It's good to hear your voice. I appreciate it. If questions come later, please contact me. It's going to take some time for the recording to be transcribed, and then I will make a post somewhere that it's ready, and then make it easy for you to get access to it.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful Easter.